The paper sliding across the dining table made a dry, scratching sound against the oak, but it was the blank signature line at the bottom that felt completely wrong. I kept my hands folded over the thick, textured cream envelope resting in my lap. My palms were sweating against the stiff parchment. The dining room smelled heavily of my mother's cinnamon potpourri and roasted chicken, a suffocating mix I had known for 39 years. "This is our family home now," my sister said. Brooke leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Pay $20,000 or never come home again." My mother, Judith, let out a soft, breathy laugh from the head of the table. My father, Raymond, refused to look at me. He just tapped his thick knuckles against the pages he had just pushed toward me. I stared at the bold letters at the top of the page. Family Home Contribution Agreement. "It is a simple family contribution, Samantha," my father said. His voice had that low, booming quality he used when he expected unquestioning obedience. "I have spent months working on this," Brooke added. "Months negotiating to buy this house back for Mom and Dad. The corporate owner has a competing offer. Their asset manager is going to accept it first thing Monday morning unless we show proof of liquid funds. We need $20,000 in my LLC account before the weekend." I looked down at the contract again. As a senior title examiner, I spent 40 hours a week dissecting real estate transactions, hunting for liens, frauds, and hidden clauses. I knew exactly how property changed hands. A legitimate seller might demand proof of funds, but they would never care how a family divided their equity internally. "You have a good job," my father said, finally meeting my eyes. "You do not have a husband or children. $20,000 will not break you." I read the terms out loud, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The contributor will not be listed on the title. The contributor holds no equity. The contribution is strictly non-refundable." I looked up from the page. "If a corporate seller needs proof of funds by Monday, where are the written instructions from their asset manager?" "All communications go through me," Brooke snapped. "I am handling the transaction." My father tapped the signature line again. "Just sign it, Samantha." The cinnamon smell in the room suddenly felt entirely too thick. I thought about the hospital bills I had paid quietly 5 years ago. I thought about my father's truck repairs, the envelopes of cash I left on the kitchen counter that miraculously vanished by morning without a single word of thanks. "You never sacrificed for this family," Brooke said, crossing her arms. "You just left. You moved away and lived your own life while I came back to take care of them." "Brooke is the one who lives here," my mother chimed in, adjusting her pearl necklace. "She is the one who truly cares about preserving our legacy." My hands tightened around the cream envelope in my lap. The sharp edges bit into my skin. "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, "are you absolutely sure this house is yours to offer?" "It is our home," he said, his jaw setting into a hard line. "Sign the paper." I did not sign. Instead, I lifted the cream envelope from my lap and slid it across the oak table, right over his ridiculous contract. My father frowned. He picked up the envelope, tore the flap, and pulled out the crisp watermarked pages. The room went dead silent. I listened to the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. He stared at the heavy black ink at the top of the certified deed. All the color drained from his face. His weathered hands began to shake. Just a fraction, making the paper rattle. Brooke snatched the document out of his hands. "What is this?" "This is fake. You printed this off the internet." My mother stopped laughing. She sat frozen, her eyes darting between my father and the paper. "You do not need to pay $20,000 to step inside your own property," I said. Brooke slammed the deed onto the table. "How did you steal this house from us? You set up a shell company to trick Mom and Dad." I ignored her accusations. I looked right at my sister. "Who exactly did you send your purchase offer to?" Brooke lifted her chin. "A corporate landlord. The management company handling the estate." "And what did they say?" I asked. "They agreed to review it," she said, her voice rising. "Every single offer, every email, every financial inquiry you sent to that management company went directly to my desk," I told her. Brooke opened her mouth to argue, but my father stood up. His chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He was not looking at the deed anymore. He was looking at me, and there was genuine panic in his eyes. "Who told you about Monday?" I asked him. "Who set that deadline? Because I certainly did not." "Enough!" my father shouted. He reached for his folder to pack away his contract. As he yanked the papers together, a pink slip of paper slid out from the back. I only caught a glimpse before he covered it, but it was enough. The bold red letters at the top read, "Notice of Default." Brooke tried to grab the folder, but he pulled it out of her reach. I stood up and picked up my purse. I left his unsigned contract sitting on the table next to my certified deed. "You have 48 hours, I said, looking at my father. "You have 48 hours to tell me exactly what that $20,000 is actually for. Because if you do not, I will let my real estate attorney find the answer." I walked out the front door, the heavy wood clicking shut behind me. The cool autumn air hit my face, clearing the smell of cinnamon and roasting meat from my lungs. I reached my car and pulled out my keys, but my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Elena, my property manager. She had forwarded an image of an email Brooke had sent her just 2 hours ago. I zoomed in on the subject line. It read, "Fast resale after family acquisition. They never planned to keep my house at all. The engine of my car remained off." I sat in the driveway, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The email subject line from Brooke read, "Fast resale after family acquisition." The words blurred together for a moment, and then the reality set in. My sister never wanted to preserve our childhood home. She wanted to flip it for a quick profit. I pressed the call button on the screen. Elena picked up on the second ring. "She contacted us 6 weeks ago," my property manager said. Her voice filled the quiet cabin of my car through the Bluetooth speakers. Brooke asked if the corporate owner would entertain a fast closing. "Freeze every single conversation with her," I instructed, gripping the steering wheel. "Done," Elena replied. "But Samantha, you need to remember something. Raymond and Judith signed the caretaker agreement. They cannot claim ignorance. They know exactly who does not own that house. Them. Even if they do not know the real owner is you, even if they do not know it is you." The truth of that statement settled heavy in my chest. They knew. 7 years ago, the crisis had felt entirely different. A frantic phone call from my mother woke me up in the middle of a rainy Tuesday night. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. I drove over in the pouring rain and found a final foreclosure notice taped to the front door. The paper was soaked, but the bright red ink remained perfectly legible. Inside, the house smelled like stale coffee and defeat. My father sat in the dark living room, refusing to turn on the lamps. He insisted he was handling the situation. He was not. The next morning, I used my access at the title company to pull the public records on the property. What I found made my stomach turn. My father had used the house as collateral for a failing business venture. The missed mortgage payments, the unpaid property taxes, and the mounting late fees created a mountain of debt. It was far too large for a simple personal loan to fix. There was only one legal way out. 2 weeks later, I sat in a sterile bank office while my parents signed a deed in lieu of foreclosure. They handed the property back to the lender to wipe out the majority of the massive debt. My father gripped his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. The scratch of the nib against the paper sounded violently loud in the quiet room. After the banker left us alone, the proud man who raised me looked at the floor. "You cannot tell Brooke about this," he demanded, his voice cracking. "Do not say a word to your aunt or anyone else. Losing this house would destroy my good name." A promise left my lips before I could think it through. Keeping my mouth shut felt like an act of loyalty at the time. The reality was much worse. My silence gave him the exact tools he needed to build a fiction. The bank moved the house into their real estate-owned inventory. Because of my job as a title examiner, the exact legal steps required to purchase a distressed property were clear to me. I hired Marcus, a sharp real estate attorney, and we formed Hawthorne Residential LLC. Through the company, I bought the house straight from the bank as an independent buyer. The purchase took every dollar of my savings. I emptied my annual bonus and a small inheritance from my grandmother. Hawthorne Residential obtained the new mortgage, and I personally guaranteed the loan with nearly every dollar I had saved. There was no magical cash buyout. The heavy burden of their debt simply transferred to my shoulders. Once the deed cleared, Elena stepped in as the public face of Hawthorne Residential. She presented my parents with a caretaker occupancy agreement. The terms were simple. They paid zero rent, handled their own utilities, and received absolutely zero equity. A month later, I stood by the kitchen sink washing dishes while my family celebrated keeping the house. My father held a beer and puffed out his chest. He loudly told Aunt Diane how he had successfully negotiated with the new corporate investors, convincing them to let the family stay. The hot water ran over my hands as I scrubbed the plates. My father continued to take credit for my life savings, and I swallowed the truth because a safe place to sleep mattered more to me than my ego. That silence cost me dearly over the next 7 years. The property tax bills came to my address. The insurance premiums followed. When the roof leaked, the invoice for the repair landed on my desk. 2 years ago, Brooke finalized her divorce and moved back in. My mother welcomed her with open arms, quickly transforming my old childhood bedroom into a real estate office. A coat of stark white paint erased my blue walls, while my old memories ended up packed into cardboard boxes in the basement. Watching it happen from the sidelines broke my heart a little more each time. I stayed quiet, foolishly waiting for the day they might appreciate me without knowing the money came from my pocket. Instead, they forgot about my contributions entirely. They built a fictional history where they were the resilient victims, and I was the cold daughter who abandoned them for the city. Now, they were using that exact fictional history to extort me for $20,000. My phone chimed, pulling me out of the past and back into the dark driveway. Elena had sent a new message. It contained a scanned document attachment. I opened the file and recognized the caretaker occupancy agreement from 7 years ago. Elena had highlighted a specific section near the bottom of the second page. Beside the highlighted text sat my father's distinct, jagged initials. The ink was a faded blue, but the intent was crystal clear. The clause read, "Occupant shall not claim or imply any right to sell the property." My father knew exactly what he was doing. His entire pitch at the dining table tonight was not just a manipulation. It was a direct, documented violation of the very contract he had signed to save himself. The glaring blue light of my phone woke me up at 6 in the morning. My sister's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring twice before swiping to answer, sitting up in my dark bedroom. "You used a shell company to trick our parents," Brooke hissed. Her voice sounded thin, lacking the confident smirk she wore at the dining table last night. "You bought the house behind their backs." I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and took a slow breath. "If you looked up the tax records and saw a corporate company owned the property, why did you tell Mom and Dad it was their house?" Silence hung on the line. The brilliant real estate agent had trapped herself. "I am trying to fix your mess," Brooke finally snapped, completely dodging the question. "I am getting this family's legacy back." She hung up before I could reply. I set the phone down on the nightstand, knowing exactly what she was trying to fix: her own bank account. 2 hours later, I sat in my office at the title company with a fresh cup of coffee. Elena had securely transmitted the entire purchase file Brooke had submitted to Hawthorne Residential. The paperwork sat on my monitor in crisp digital clarity. My sister had proposed buying the property under a brand new company managed by her and our father. The earnest money line remained blank, noted only as pending family capital contribution. More importantly, the file contained absolutely zero correspondence from the seller demanding a Monday morning deadline. My father had completely fabricated the competing offer to panic me into handing over cash. Brooke had requested a 30-day fast closing and the right to assign the contract to an affiliate buyer. That assignment clause was the real key. I clicked open the next attachment, a chain of emails Brooke had sent to the management company meant to prove her business connections. She had been emailing a representative at Langford Urban for over 6 weeks. The massive development firm was quietly buying up parcels in our old neighborhood. According to the email chain, Langford would pay a massive premium to acquire 3 adjacent lots for a new townhouse project. Our childhood home sat right in the middle of their target map. Brooke never intended to save the house. She planned to secure the purchase, assign the contract straight to Langford Urban, and walk away with a massive flipping fee. My office door swung open. Marcus, the real estate attorney who helped me form my company 7 years ago, walked in holding a printed copy of the contract my father had tried to make me sign last night. "I reviewed the family contribution agreement," Marcus said, taking a seat across from my desk. He dropped the pages onto the wood surface. "It is a masterpiece of exploitation." He pointed to the second section. The document explicitly stated my $20,000 was non-refundable and granted me zero equity in the property. A lower paragraph named Brooke as the sole transaction representative, forcing the contributor to waive any right to object to a future contract assignment. "It never says they have to keep the house," I noted, tracing the heavy legal text with my pen. Marcus nodded. "It gives them total clearance to take your money, buy the property, and sell it to a developer the very next day, without giving you a single dime of the profits." The betrayal ran deeper than a simple real estate flip. Last night, I had forwarded the digital copy of the agreement my father emailed me to my work server. Checking the document metadata took less than a minute. I turned my monitor so Marcus could see the property history tab. The digital fingerprints told a miserable story. Brooke had created the original file on her laptop 3 days ago. My father accessed it a day later, directly editing the property rights section to ensure my lack of equity. Finally, my mother opened the document yesterday afternoon. Judith had personally typed the final clause, the one demanding that anyone refusing to sign had chosen to abandon the family. All 3 of them had a hand in crafting the weapon. I turned the monitor back around. A strange, cold clarity washed over me. I did not want to yell or cry. I wanted to see exactly how far my sister would take her lies. "Elena," I said, tapping the speakerphone button on my desk, "I want you to proceed with standard due diligence for a fast closing on her offer. Ask Brooke for proof of funds, a source of funds letter, and a proposed disbursement schedule." Marcus raised an eyebrow but stayed quiet. As a high-risk buyer requesting an assignment, Brooke would be legally required to provide those documents. I was not setting a trap. I was simply making her play by the rules she had invoked. We waited in silence. 20 minutes later, a new email popped into the inbox. Elena had forwarded Brooke's response. The message from my sister read smoothly, assuring the management company that her older sister had formally agreed to contribute the capital. It was her first documented written misrepresentation. She had lied in a formal real estate transaction, claiming she had my funds when my unsigned contract still sat on my father's dining room table. Then, a second email from Brooke arrived. The text at the bottom of the screen made the air leave my lungs. "The $20,000 will be available by Monday," Brooke wrote. "My father's lender has already granted us until then." I stared at the word lender. The fake Monday deadline was not completely fabricated after all. It was real, but it had absolutely nothing to do with buying a house. My father owed someone a lot of money, and the clock was rapidly ticking down. The word lender echoed in my mind, ringing much louder than the morning traffic outside my office window. I pulled up the county clerk public portal on my computer and typed in the name of my sister's old flipping company. Searching commercial lawsuits required zero special access, just knowing exactly where to look. The search results populated instantly, and right at the top sat a massive commercial lien filed 3 weeks ago. I clicked the document icon, scrolling past the standard legal boilerplate until I reached the signature page. My stomach dropped. There, signed in bold black ink, was my father's name listed as the personal guarantor. Pieces of a puzzle from 18 months ago suddenly snapped together. I remembered the smell of wet drywall and cold dust when Brooke dragged us to see a gutted property across town. She had stood in the ruined kitchen, bragging about profit margins, while our father clapped her on the shoulder and called the disaster their golden ticket. 2 weeks later, my mother had called me, whispering into the phone, asking for a small loan to help with some unexpected foundation issues. I had refused. The contractors walked out shortly after, and Brooke sold the ruin at a staggering loss. According to the public filing on my screen, the outstanding debt sat at almost $180,000. Marcus leaned over my desk, looking at the glowing monitor. He pointed to a specific paragraph near the bottom of the default notice, matching the pink slip I had seen hidden in my father's folder the night before. "They are demanding a minimum forbearance payment of $20,000 by Monday," Marcus explained, his voice low and clinical. "If the creditor does not get that money, they will execute the guarantee. They can sue on the guarantee, obtain a judgment, and pursue his non-exempt bank accounts and personal assets. His truck and boat could be exposed, even if some retirement funds remain protected. The fake real estate emergency was never about buying our childhood home. The urgent deadline was a desperate attempt to buy time with a hostile creditor, using a fake property acquisition to drain my bank account. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, followed by my office door swinging open without a knock. My father stepped inside. He wore his heavy work boots and a faded denim jacket, looking entirely out of place among the glass walls and leather chairs of the title agency. "You embarrassed me last night," my father said. He did not bother saying hello. I closed the browser tab and folded my hands on the desk. "You guaranteed Brooke's failed house flip. You owe a commercial lender nearly $180,000, and they want $20,000 by Monday to hold off the lawsuit." The color drained from his face for a second time in 12 hours, but the shock quickly hardened into anger. The old man took a heavy step closer to my desk, looming over the glass surface. "Brooke just needs one more chance to get her business off the ground," he said, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You have the money. You can fix this. A good daughter would not sit there judging her family while they drown." I looked at the weathered hands that had built my childhood treehouse. The cold knot of guilt that usually lived in my chest finally unraveled, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. "I am not paying your commercial debt," I told him. "If you do not help us," my father warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous gravel, "I will call your Aunt Diane. I will call everyone. I will tell the whole family how you used a fake company to steal our home behind our backs." I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a copy of the deed in lieu of foreclosure from 7 years ago, and slid the paper across the desk toward him. "You gave the house to the bank," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "You begged me to keep it a secret so you would not lose your pride. Go ahead and call Aunt Diane. Tell her the truth. But I am not writing a check." He stared at the document, his jaw working furiously, before turning around and marching out of the office. The heavy glass door slammed shut behind him. 10 minutes later, a notification popped up on my screen. Elena had forwarded the proof of funds package Brooke had submitted to comply with the fast closing requirements. I opened the attached workbook, noting the file was simply named Proposed Disbursement Schedule. The main screen displayed a basic list of closing costs and a vague line item for family capital. However, as I clicked through the cells, a formula in the total column caught my eye. It referenced a separate tab that was not visible at the bottom of the screen. Brooke had locked nothing. She possessed enough arrogance to assume property managers only skimmed the front page, so I right-clicked the bottom menu and hit Unhide. A new sheet appeared, titled Keen House Exit Plan. I read the rows, my pulse thudding in my ears. Row 1 listed the exact payoff amount for my father's guarantee. Row 2 outlined the profit split with the developer. The final row simply read, Samantha contribution, 0 equity. They had built an entire financial model around exploiting me, and reading the raw numbers on a spreadsheet hurt worse than any argument. But then my eyes drifted to a small note typed at the very bottom of the page, a contingency plan for failure. The text read, Contingency, if acquisition fails, Brooke assumes document responsibility. My father had not just planned to use my money to save his retirement. He had actively laid the groundwork to throw his favorite daughter entirely to the wolves if he got caught. My phone began vibrating against the glass surface of my desk before my father even reached the parking lot. The rhythmic buzzing rattled my coffee cup. I picked up the device and saw the extended family group chat exploding with notifications. My mother had just posted a massive wall of text. Judith claimed her oldest daughter had secretly purchased the family home and now threatened to throw her elderly parents onto the street. Brooke immediately chimed in, typing that she had only been trying to bring the property back to the family. Cousins and aunts began sending shocked emojis, asking how I could be so cruel. They conveniently left out the part where the bank had taken the property long before I ever signed a check. Aunt Diane called 3 minutes later. I answered the phone, leaning back in my leather desk chair. "Did you really take advantage of your parents when they were desperate?" my aunt asked. Her voice was tight, with righteous disapproval. Silence felt incredibly familiar. It was a comfortable blanket I had worn for 7 years to keep the peace. But keeping the peace just meant letting their lies win. Ask my mother what she signed 7 years ago, I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Ask her to explain the deed in lieu of foreclosure. Diane hesitated. The angry breath hitched in her throat, and I ended the call. Elena sent over the final pages of the submitted email chains a moment later. Right in the middle of the thread sat a forwarded text conversation between my mother and sister. Reading the blue bubbles felt like peeling back a layer of skin. Judith had carefully orchestrated the entire ambush at the dining table. My mother had faked my father's chest pains specifically to ensure I would drive over alone in a panic. Make it about whether she loves us, not about the money, Judith had texted Brooke. The matriarch had even tried to invite Aunt Diane and Uncle Robert to witness the confrontation, hoping an audience would force me to open my checkbook. When the relatives could not make it, my parents sprung the trap anyway. I met the woman who raised me at a neutral coffee shop downtown 2 hours later. The place smelled strongly of roasted espresso beans and burnt milk. Judith sat in a corner booth, stirring a latte she had not tasted. Tears streamed down her powdered cheeks the moment I sat down. "We were just trying to keep the house, Samantha," she whispered. She dabbed her eyes with a crumpled paper napkin. "Your father has been under so much stress." I watched her practice performance, feeling nothing but exhaustion. Why does someone who wants to keep a house draft a contract allowing it to be sold to a developer immediately? I asked. The crying stopped instantly. My mother lowered the napkin and looked out the window, suddenly unable to meet my eyes. "I knew they might sell it," she admitted. Her voice lost its fragile tremor, becoming flat and practical. "But the profit would have kept this family safe. Your father is hiding something terrible about our finances." I did not want to know the details, as long as we were protected. Judith knew. The gentle peacemaker had known the house would be destroyed. But she deliberately avoided asking about the debt so the flip would fund her comfortable lifestyle. "You should have trusted us enough to say you owned the place," Judith said. She leaned forward, incredibly shifting the blame back to me. "If you had just been honest, we would not be in this mess." I stared at her across the small wooden table. "You all just proved exactly why I could not tell you." My mother reached across the table, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled away. "Please, Samantha," she begged. "Keep this in the family. Do not show those documents to your aunt." Keeping it in the family simply meant keeping me silent. Returning to my office, I opened a new blank document. I compiled the certified deed, the occupancy agreement from 7 years ago, the payment timeline, and screenshots of the emails into a single file. It formed a massive correction packet, ready to be emailed to every single relative in our group chat. But I did not hit send. I sent one final text message to my mother instead, giving them 24 hours to tell the truth in the chat themselves. Her reply arrived 60 seconds later. A good daughter would never humiliate her parents. My phone screen went dark, only to light up immediately with an incoming call from Brooke. I answered, fully expecting more threats. Instead, my sister sounded completely frantic. "Dad found out you know about the debt," Brooke gasped. The panic in her throat sounded entirely real this time. "He is planning to tell everyone the contract was mine." The frantic phone call from Brooke ended abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in my office. Less than an hour later, a sharp, aggressive knock rattled the front door of my townhome. I opened it to find my sister standing on the porch, clutching a silver laptop tightly against her chest. The cold autumn wind whipped her perfectly styled hair into a messy tangle, and her expensive mascara was badly smudged under her eyes. "He is erasing everything," Brooke said. She pushed past me into the living room, without waiting for an invitation, and dropped a thick stack of printed papers onto my glass coffee table. According to my sister, our father had spent the last hours scrubbing his name from every digital folder on their shared business drive. Raymond planned to leave only the initial emails where Brooke proposed the house flip to the developer. "You have to sign a statement," Brooke demanded, flipping open her laptop. Her hands were shaking violently. "I need a sworn declaration from you saying Raymond controlled the entire real estate negotiation." I watched her panicked movements, feeling a strange mixture of pity and absolute disgust. Lying on a legal document to save a sister who had just tried to steal my house was out of the question. I flatly refused. Brooke turned the laptop screen toward me, desperation leaking into her voice. Just look at what he sent to the commercial lender this morning. An email from my father's personal account filled the glowing display. The message to his creditor was a masterclass in shifting blame and avoiding accountability. My father claimed he was merely an elderly man who blindly trusted his daughter's business expertise. He stated Brooke managed all transactions, handled the bank accounts, and bore sole responsibility for any delays regarding the $20,000 payment. However, Brooke clicked over to a different tab, revealing a separate chain of hidden messages. Those internal emails clearly showed Raymond actively drafting the family contribution agreement. The timestamps proved he was the one who explicitly set the fake Monday morning deadline, and he had calculated exactly how much of my money would go toward his debt versus the closing costs. "Can I back these up?" I asked, pointing at the screen. She nodded frantically, desperate for any ally. I walked over to my desk, grabbed a secure flash drive, and copied the entire unaltered email history. The evidence chain was finally complete. The downloaded files proved both of them were active architects of the extortion, not helpless victims of circumstance. Brooke collapsed onto my sofa, burying her face in her hands. "You always do this," she muttered, her voice muffled by her fingers. "You always sit there looking so perfectly in control, making me look like a complete failure." A bitter laugh escaped my throat before I could stop it. "I paid the mortgage on that house for 7 years in total silence. Nobody knew anything about my so-called perfection." "Exactly," Brooke snapped, looking up with red, angry eyes. "You handle massive problems quietly, and it makes everyone else feel small. I hated that you could just fix things without ever asking for credit or praise." Standing in my living room, the crushing weight of the last 7 years finally made sense. My silent fixing had broken our family in 2 very different ways. It turned me into a bottomless bank account for their mistakes, and it convinced Brooke she would never have to face the real-world consequences of her own actions. My sister wiped her eyes and leaned forward, offering a new deal. If I helped her pin the entire fraud on our father, she would formally withdraw the purchase offer from the management company. Furthermore, she promised to tell the whole extended family that I was the rightful owner of the property. "Canceling a scam does not mean the scam never happened," I told her, keeping my voice firm and low. Brooke stared at me, waiting for the usual rescue that always came. It was the same look she gave me when we were children, and she broke a window, expecting me to take the blame. "I will submit the real documents to the authorities if they ask for them," I continued. "I will not exaggerate your involvement, but I will not hide your emails to protect you." The realization that I was no longer her permanent shield hit Brooke hard. All the frantic energy drained from her posture. She packed up her laptop without saying another word, walked out the front door, and drove away. The next morning, I met Marcus at the title agency. My real estate attorney immediately filed a legal hold, requiring all parties to preserve any documents related to the purchase offer. At the exact same time, Elena archived the management company's servers, ensuring Brooke could not alter her original submission emails. If your sister misrepresents her funding to another seller, she could easily lose her real estate license, Marcus advised, organizing the printed files on my desk. We began drafting a formal complaint to the state licensing board, holding the paperwork ready just in case she tried to spin the story again. More importantly, Marcus started preparing a formal notice of material breach regarding the caretaker occupancy agreement my parents had signed 7 years ago. The legal clock for eviction was about to start ticking. My desk phone rang just before noon. Elena was on the line, sounding completely bewildered. "Raymond just called the management office," Elena reported, her voice thick with disbelief. "He claimed to be the authorized representative of the corporate owner. My father had actually tried to order a locksmith to change the deadbolts on the house, attempting to lock me out of my own property." Elena had recorded the demand in the official tenant log and immediately refused the request. The sheer audacity of the move left me speechless. My father knew the truth, yet he still tried to use brute force to seize control. Hours later, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the city into a deep autumn chill. My cell phone buzzed on the nightstand with a high-priority alert from Elena. She had forwarded a still image captured by the exterior security camera mounted above the garage of my childhood home. The grainy night vision picture showed a large moving truck parked halfway onto the front lawn. Two figures, Brooke and my father, were hauling heavy cardboard boxes out of the open garage door under the cover of darkness. Looking at the shadowy image, my chest tightened. I had no idea if they were frantically destroying the remaining paper evidence, or if they had simply decided to strip everything of value from my house before the legal notices arrived. The grainy security footage of the moving truck haunted me through the night, but the sun rose with a cold, unforgiving clarity. I arrived at the property at 8 in the morning with Elena and a licensed property inspector. The house sat in the morning light, looking exactly as it had for decades, yet the silence surrounding it felt heavy with the scent of pine and impending confrontation. Raymond stood on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest like a barricade. He glared at us, refusing to budge even as I stepped onto the first stair. "You have no business here," my father said, his voice dropping into that familiar, gravelly tone he used to intimidate waitstaff. I ignored him and pulled the signed caretaker occupancy agreement from my bag. "I am here for a mandatory property inspection, Raymond. The contract you signed 7 years ago grants the owner the right to verify the condition of the home with reasonable notice." Elena held up a digital tablet, showing the log of his illegal attempt to change the locks the previous night. My father stared at the screen, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He finally stepped aside, though he followed us into the foyer like a shadow, his breathing audible and ragged. The interior of the house felt alien. Boxes were scattered everywhere, and the pristine hardwood floors were scuffed where heavy furniture had been dragged across them. I walked into the hallway, past the kitchen, and stopped in front of what used to be my room. Brooke had replaced the door, and the interior was now a sterile office filled with architectural blueprints and stacks of glossy brochures. I walked over to the corner where my old vanity had stood. My heart thudded against my ribs as I saw my cardboard boxes from the basement shoved into the corner, many of them crushed and torn open. An old photograph of me at my college graduation lay on the floor, face down, covered in a thin layer of drywall dust. My sister had not just claimed the space, she had tried to erase my existence within these 4 walls. Elena started walking through the rooms with the inspector, methodically comparing the home's original features against the detailed inventory list created when my parents first moved in as caretakers. The sounds of their clipboards clicking and voices counting fixtures filled the empty rooms. "The light fixtures in the dining room are gone," Elena noted, marking her tablet with a firm tap. "The antique bronze handles on the pantry door have been removed, and several built-in cabinets are missing their original hardware." "They are family heirlooms," Judith shouted from the kitchen, her voice trembling with practiced indignation. "We are just taking what belongs to us." I walked over to the kitchen island, pulling out my phone to reference the master invoice for the massive renovation I had funded 3 years prior. "Those fixtures were installed as part of the total house restoration project," I said, my voice echoing in the sparse room. "They are permanent fixtures of the property. Put them back by the end of the day, or I will file a theft report." Raymond growled, but he retreated into the living room, leaving the bronze pieces on the counter. While the inspector worked, I wandered into the dark garage, where the moving truck had been parked the night before. Several boxes remained scattered on the oil-stained concrete. I walked over to a stack of flattened cardboard that looked like a discarded afterthought. A heavy binder had tumbled out from the pile, its spine cracked and split. I crouched down and opened the cover. The pages contained detailed plans from Langford Urban. It was not just a general development map. These were specific demolition diagrams marked with the dates for every house on our street. The childhood home I had spent 7 years protecting was scheduled for complete destruction to make way for a modern townhouse complex. The realization stung more than the debt or the lies. My sister had never cared about the legacy she claimed to be preserving. She had traded our history for a developer's check, and she was more than happy to flatten the very roof under which she grew up. I snapped several photos of the demolition diagrams with my phone, the flash illuminating the cold gray concrete. As we walked out to the driveway, Marcus pulled up in his car. He stepped out, his expression grim as he handed my father a thick, white envelope. It was the formal notice of material breach. "This document outlines the documented violations of your occupancy agreement, including the unauthorized attempted changes to the property locks and the removal of permanent fixtures, Marcus said, his tone entirely professional. You have 30 days to vacate the premises, or we will initiate formal eviction proceedings in court. Raymond snatched the envelope, his hands trembling so hard the paper rattled. He turned to me, his eyes wide and desperate. If you force us out, Samantha, I will tell the whole town what you did. I will make sure everyone knows you are the cold-hearted daughter who ruined this family. I reached into my bag and pulled out the rough draft of the correction packet I had prepared for our relatives. I held it out for him to see. You can tell them the truth, Raymond, I said, looking him dead in the eye. Or I can let this paperwork do the talking for me. Your choice. He lunged for the packet, snatching it from my hand and tearing the top page in half. He did not realize that the original digital copy was already resting in my attorney's secure drive. As we turned to walk back to our cars, my mother rushed onto the porch, clutching a small, dusty envelope. Her face was pale, and she looked smaller than she had in years. She shoved the envelope into my hands, her fingers icy against my palm. Your father wrote this 7 years ago, during the week the bank took the house, she whispered. He never had the courage to mail it. I took the envelope, my stomach turning as I saw my father's cramped handwriting on the front. I did not open it there. I just stared at the house, feeling the distance between myself and the family I once thought I needed to save. The inspector caught my gaze from the porch, offering a sympathetic nod. He knew what it was like to deal with families who valued pride over honesty. Samantha, Judith sobbed, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the street. He has been counting on you to save him longer than you know. The words felt like a confession, but as I walked to my car, I felt the heavy weight of the envelope in my hand. It was just another piece of evidence in a house of cards I had spent my entire life trying to hold together. But today, the wind was finally blowing, and I was finally ready to let it fall. I sat in my car, the engine idling, and slid a thin letter opener through the seal of the dusty envelope Judith had pressed into my hand. My father's handwriting was jagged and hurried, covering several sheets of yellowed legal paper. I read the words, but the emotional impact felt strangely muted. He had not written an apology. He had written a desperate prediction. In the letter, he detailed his financial ruin 7 years ago, insisting that I would eventually fix the mess because I could not bear to see the family name tarnished. He had been counting on my fragility, not my love, to save him from the consequences of his own greed. I folded the pages carefully and tucked them into my bag, finally understanding that my role in this family was never that of a daughter, but rather an unpaid crisis manager. I did not need to cry. I needed to move. Marcus met me at my office 5 minutes later. We executed the plan Marcus and I had assembled over the past few days, working with a precision that left no room for error. Marcus had already served the written termination notice. If they refused to leave by the deadline, he would serve the required notice to leave and file the eviction action in court. For now, the legal clock was running without a court filing. Second, I sent the prepared correction packet to the dozen relatives who had been bombarded with my mother's lies. The packet included the property deed, the occupancy agreement with my father's initials, and a timeline of the payments I had made over the last 7 years. Finally, I hit send on the digital files for the State Real Estate Licensing Board. My phone started pinging almost immediately. Relatives began replying to the group chat, their messages shifting from confused questions to sharp accusations directed at my mother. If she owned the house this whole time, why did she let us believe she was the villain? One aunt asked. Judith did not answer. She left the group chat altogether, leaving behind a digital graveyard of her own construction. The quiet in my office felt powerful. I looked at the clock, watching the minutes tick by. Somewhere, in a dingy apartment or perhaps even the childhood home they were currently packing, my father was realizing that the leverage he once held over me had evaporated into thin air. The commercial lender for my father's failed project did not wait. Without the promised payment, they filed the motion to execute the personal guarantee. Raymond called me 20 minutes after the filing hit the public record. His voice sounded thin, stripped of all its former arrogance. "Samantha, please," he said, the desperation palpable. "They are going to attach the lien to my retirement accounts. If you could just lend us the money, I would pay you back every single cent. I promise. I stared at the screen of my computer, watching the cursor blink on a blank document. If I save you again, will you sign the house over to me officially and move out by the end of the week? I asked. The line went silent. My father could not offer me the house because he had never truly owned it, and he refused to acknowledge my authority even while begging for my cash. He did not want a solution. He wanted a transaction where he kept the power and I took the risk. I cannot do that, he whispered, finally admitting the truth of his position. I am not a bank, Dad, I said, and then I ended the call. Brooke did not fare much better. By noon, the brokerage firm where she worked announced her indefinite suspension pending an internal investigation into the Langford urban real estate flip. The developers sent a formal demand for the refund of all surveying and consultation fees they had paid based on my sister's false promises. She called me, her voice shaking with rage, screaming that I was the one who ruined her career. You ruined your own career the second you lied on a purchase agreement, Brooke, I said, watching the rain start to smear the glass of my window. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. The emails you sent to the management company are evidence of intent to defraud. I did not create that trail. I only made sure it stayed visible. She hung up, but the damage was already done. The most satisfying moment of the day came when I checked the group chat one last time. My mother had tried to call Diane, but my aunt refused to pick up. The family that had once been rallied against me was now focused entirely on the truth I had revealed. Judith had lost the narrative she spent decades perfecting, and there was no one left to listen to her tears. I looked out at the city as the afternoon faded into a gray, moody twilight. My family stood together on the steps of my office building for one final confrontation. They had come to plead, to blame, and to find a way to make me feel guilty enough to surrender. Raymond turned to Brooke, his face twisting with betrayal. You told me the lender would wait. You said Samantha was an easy mark. Brooke shoved her phone into his face, displaying the chain of emails. You changed the deadline. You added the contingency clause to throw me under the bus if the deal went south. My mother stood between them, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. She looked at both of them, her mouth opening to offer a defense that would never come. None of you came here to apologize, I said, walking toward them with my hands tucked into the pockets of my blazer. I felt cold, but the paralyzing fear of their disapproval was gone. You came here to choose which one of you I should save first. I walked past them toward my car, leaving the three of them standing there in the middle of the parking lot, already turning on one another. The bitter realization of their own selfishness was the only consequence they truly understood, and for the first time in years, the burden of their failures did not belong to me. Brooke caught up to me just as I reached the door. Her eyes were hard, reflecting a lifetime of wanting things that did not belong to her. Mom will not leave, she hissed, leaning close enough that I could smell her frantic perfume. She thinks you will break first. She thinks you need her approval more than you need the house. I looked at my sister, feeling the final, sharp severing of a tie I had held onto out of sheer habit. She is wrong, I said. I got into the car and drove away, leaving my family in the rearview mirror, already beginning the slow, painful process of falling apart. The cliffhanger of their lives was no longer my problem to solve, and as I drove into the night, I realized I had not checked my phone once to see if they were following. I was finally free. 30 days later, the morning of the move felt brittle, like the air might shatter if anyone spoke too loudly. A massive moving truck blocked the driveway, its engine idling with a rhythmic low thrum that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. Elena stood near the porch, clipboard in hand, carefully comparing every item being carried out against the original inventory list from 7 years ago. Aunt Diane and my cousin Sarah had arrived shortly after dawn, not to help, but because my mother had spent the entire night leaving panicked voicemails, claiming I was throwing them into the street without a roof. I handed Diane a copy of the official notice and the signed occupancy agreement. She read the documents in silence, her brow furrowed as the reality of my parents' deception finally settled in. The accusations of cruelty died on her lips as she looked from the legal paperwork to my mother, who was currently standing in the center of the living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes, and weeping loudly for the benefit of anyone watching. Judith stood in the middle of the kitchen, clutching a dusty, framed photo of the entire family from a vacation taken before the foreclosure. She looked at me with eyes rimmed red from exhaustion and stage-managed grief. "How can you do this, Samantha?" she asked, her voice cracking for the audience in the hallway. "This is the home where you grew up. You are destroying the only place that keeps this family together." I reached into my bag and pulled out the signed occupancy agreement. I held it out so she could see her own name, clear and bold, at the bottom of the page. "You knew this property belonged to Hawthorne Residential for 7 years, Mom," I said, my voice steady enough to cut through the tension. "You were perfectly content living here as a guest until you realized the landlord was your own daughter. You did not care about keeping the family together. You cared about maintaining the fiction that you still owned the world." Raymond appeared from the hallway, struggling with a heavy box of old tools. He stopped glaring at me and tried to jam the front door key into the lock on his way out. "This key belongs to the house," he snarled, trying to retain some shred of the authority he had lost weeks ago. "That key is for the locks you tried to change illegally," I corrected him. I held out my hand, demanding the metal ring. "Hand it over, Raymond." He hesitated, his knuckles white as he gripped the ring. Then he slammed the keys onto the entryway table with such force that the glass rattled. "You lost it before I saved it," I reminded him quietly, the words pulling the last bit of air out of his lungs. Brooke watched the exchange from the threshold, her face a mask of bitter resentment. She still clutched her phone, probably refreshing the brokerage website to see if her suspension had been lifted. I walked over to her and held out the copy of the Keene House exit plan I had printed earlier that morning. "You told Aunt Diane you were trying to save the house for them," I said, handing the papers to my aunt, who began reading the profit projections aloud to the room. Brooke could not argue with the math. The lines about zero equity for me and massive payouts for her and our father were underlined in red ink. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother stopped crying, and my father simply stared at the floor, the weight of their failed conspiracy finally resting on their shoulders instead of mine. The last of the boxes were loaded into the truck by early afternoon. The house felt strangely quiet, a hollow shell stripped of the lies that had occupied it for so long. Elena tapped me on the shoulder, confirming the walkthrough was complete and the keys were secured. "What else do you want from us?" Brooke asked as she climbed into the passenger seat of their rental car. I looked at the three of them. These people who had spent my entire life teaching me that my only value was in what I could provide for them. "I wanted a sister," I said, feeling the finality of the words as they left my lips. "You wanted an investor who was not allowed to own anything." I turned my back on them and walked into the house, signaling for Elena to lock the heavy front door. I stood in the entryway until I heard the rental car pull away, their tires crunching against the gravel driveway as they left the neighborhood for good. The house was completely empty, yet it felt larger than it had in years. I walked into my old room, the one Brooke had turned into an office. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I knelt by the wall where the carpet had been peeled back. There, etched into the drywall in fading pencil marks, were the lines measuring our height from years gone by. Next to Brooke's name, there was a tiny, scrawled sentence from when she was 7 years old, written in the shaky hand of a child. "Sam will always take care of me." I sat there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing against my skin. I took a small piece of wood trim from my bag and began framing the marks, preserving the memory without letting it control the room. I was not erasing the past, but I was finally stopping the cycle that had demanded my life as a sacrifice. I stood up, feeling a strange, quiet strength. For the first time in my life, I walked through the rooms of the home I had saved, knowing that I did not need to ask anyone for permission to exist inside its walls. The next 2 months passed with a quiet intensity that felt entirely foreign. Brooke faced a relentless investigation from the state licensing board, resulting in her professional credentials being suspended indefinitely. She sold her expensive sports car and downsized her office, forced to negotiate directly with the developer she had once tried to outmaneuver. I did not step in to help, and for the first time, she had to face the reality of a life built on shortcuts. My father spent those weeks dismantling the life he had projected. The commercial lender executed the personal guarantee, forcing him to sell his boat and his heavy truck to settle a portion of the debt. He and my mother moved into a cramped, single-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. I sent them a printed list of financial counseling services I found through the county extension office, but I refused to pay a single cent toward the remaining balance. It was the kindest thing I could do for them and for myself. Thanksgiving arrived with a different rhythm. Aunt Diane hosted the meal in her own dining room. The family was smaller, and the air was not thick with the usual performance of manufactured harmony. Judith called me once, her voice sounding small and tired, asking if we could be a family again for the holidays. Was I family when you told me to pay $20,000 or never come home again? I asked. She did not answer, and I ended the call before she could start the cycle of weeping all over again. I knew she was lonely, but loneliness was not a justification for the cruelty I had endured. Brooke sent a long, meandering text message about how much she had lost, never once mentioning the people she had hurt. My father sent a letter claiming he had merely made a mistake in judgment, avoiding any specific reference to the extortion. I kept both messages in a folder on my phone, not to study them, but to remind myself that their versions of the truth would always protect their egos first. I did not reply. Inside the house, I turned the office back into a quiet sanctuary. I kept the wood-framed height marks on the wall, a permanent record of who we once were, but I painted the rest of the room a soft, calming shade of blue. It was not an act of forgiveness. It was an act of ownership. I invited Marcus, Elena, and a few close friends over for a simple dinner. The table felt light and unburdened. We talked about work, books, and the changing leaves outside the window. Nobody asked for money. Nobody demanded that I perform a specific role. I walked to the hallway closet, pulled out the deed to the property, and placed it inside my wall safe. It was no longer a shield against my family, nor was it a weapon of war. It was just a piece of paper, a reminder of the day I stopped running. I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. The neighborhood was peaceful, and my home was finally quiet. I breathed in, feeling the cool autumn air fill my chest. For the first time in my life, I came home without asking anyone's permission. You might think that keeping the peace means staying silent when you are being used, but you have to understand that your loyalty should never be a blank check for those who refuse to respect your boundaries. Samantha's journey teaches us that you cannot save people from the consequences of their own choices, no matter how much you love them or how deep your history runs. When you constantly step in to fix someone else's messes, you aren't being a hero. You are merely teaching them that they never have to grow up or take responsibility for their own lives. True strength is realizing that you can hold on to your kindness without handing over your dignity or your future in the process. You have the right to walk away from anyone who forces you to choose between their survival and your own sanity. Protecting your peace is not an act of selfishness, but a necessary form of survival that ultimately honors the person you were meant to become. Have you ever felt like you were setting yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm? And what was the moment that finally made you decide it was time to reclaim your own life?